Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Old Spook Lane Creepy Chats, where we're covering creepy topics here on Creepy Chats, and we're continuing Tim Burton Month. I'm Patricia, and I'm here with Arun Mehta from the Arun Mehta Show.
Hey.
Edward Scissorhands is our next adventure into the land of Tim Burton. And yeah, it definitely does feel akin to like a proper streak that he's been having with Beetlejuice and Pee-wee's Big Adventure. But this came out shortly after the release of Batman. And so, yeah, I think with Batman, it was definitely when he was like really striking it into the mainstream because, you know, adapting a DC superhero that hasn't had a major adaptation since like the Adam West TV show, and the fact that it was much more of a darker take, very similar to Frank Miller's Batman. So yeah, this is when I think that Hollywood was seeing that Tim Burton was definitely a major contender. We said that before with Beetlejuice, but I think with Batman, this is when a lot of people started to have Tim Burton on their minds when creating more unique and more idiosyncratic films. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely something like you would not expect at the time when you were to see a film in theaters.
Yeah, and I think with Edward Scissorhands, I think a lot of people still fondly remember this movie and from a while back ago, but released in 1990, so it's had a lot of age on it since then. But I think a lot of people still go back to it from time and again and say it's like, you know, it definitely is one of Tim Burton's more one of his celebrated movies, effectively. And so I mean, back in the day, it only made about it took $20 million to make and made about $86 million at the box office worldwide, and that was like respectable, I think, at that time.
Yes, it was pretty respectable at that time, absolutely. Especially since Edward Scissorhands was definitely not a major film that you would think, oh yeah, let's just have this, you know, major promotion for it. Because apparently, from what I've heard in an article not like that was released around the same time as Edward Scissorhands, was that 20th Century Fox didn't want to give it a major promotional piece because he felt that it was just like not the type of film to have that major promotional release, which
it feels very indie, doesn't it? Like this feels like an indie film more than it does feel like, you know, a massive, like, you know, major studio production, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of Tim Burton's early films were essentially like that. I mean, you know, Pee-wee's Big Adventure was essentially like, okay, it's more or less an indie film, but, you know, just have a major 80s icon. And Beetlejuice, I would say, is definitely akin to that, where, you know, it's not based off of like a pre-existing property. It's not based off of like a book or something that's already existed before. It was definitely its own original thing. The closest thing at the time would have been Batman, where it was definitely a lot more in the mainstream at that point in time. But yeah, Edward Scissorhands, again, we're definitely leaning more towards that originality, that feel of an indie movie just released by a major studio.
Oh, by the way, this story is also very personal to Tim Burton because this is conceived. Edward Scissorhands was conceived from his childhood upbringing in suburban Burbank, California.
if you listen to a lot of documentaries, or if you listen to a lot of commentary, you can definitely tell that Tim Burton was definitely like the odd one amongst everybody else around him. Like, his parents didn't exactly understand his expressionism, and he was like deemed as like the weird one towards his peers. So yeah, I can definitely see like around that time period where, when he was growing up in California, he was definitely like somebody who just didn't really fit in towards like what you would expect to see from a cookie cutter teenager. So
I'm pretty sure it would be when your dad is Vincent Price. That's a joke, by the way. I'm just kidding.
I guess that's true.
uh,
Yeah. It's actually funny about Vincent Price, because if you remember, this wasn't the first time that Tim Burton had worked with Vincent Price. As you know, he was brought in for his short film, Vincent, and then he really enjoyed his work. And so he brought him in for one of his last roles in Edward Scissorhands. And there's no introduction for who Vincent Price is. He's essentially like the king of horror movies. He's been in so many horror films throughout his career, and he just has this very charismatic personality that just shines in with every performance that he's been in. You may know him for his narration on Michael Jackson's Thriller. You may know him as Radigan from The Great Mouse Detective. I mean, he's been in so many things.
And by the way, there is a misconception to Edward Scissorhands when it comes to Vincent Price, because a lot of people keep saying, I've noticed this when I go through some YouTube videos, that they said that this was Vincent Price's last performance. Wrong. He was in Dennis Hopper's Catchfire in 1990, and also, if you really want to go technical with it, the last movie that he was in was 1995's The Thief and the Cobbler. By Richard Williams.
Yeah, but The Thief and the Cobbler has been in like developmental hell for several decades. I mean, that was in production since all the way back in the 60s. But The Persistence of Vision is a great documentary that you should check out if you really want to know more information about Thief and the Cobbler. But yeah, I would say that for like Vincent Price's final performance, I guess it's a subject of debate, because productions and depending on when the film is going to be released. So yeah, I guess I can see why some people would say that this was his last film, even though technically it wasn't. But anyway, besides all that, but yeah, he only appears in the film for a little bit, where he's essentially Edward's creation, but he never got to finish him. And after a while, when he passed away, Edward was living in this home pretty much all by himself until Peg discovers him. Once again, we have
Vincent Price basically is a mad inventor, effectively. Like, you can see how crazy everything is around him. Like, he's like Willy Wonka if he never really had a filter.
Exactly. Yeah, he's a combination of Frankenstein meets with Willy Wonka. Just like absolutely mad with his creations. I mean, just the entire.
I can take you in a world of imagination. Oh my God.
Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I think that seeing this huge laboratory that the inventor is in, and then just seeing him interacting with Edward is very sweet, I will admit. It's just a shame that he isn't in the movie as much, which I guess it makes a lot of sense, because Vincent Price at that point in time was already approaching age. And so but I don't
think it was anything to do with that. I think it was more the fact that even though he was like the idea of like Edward Scissorhands is like he is just kind of this anomaly of mystery. Like, where did he come from? Like, why was he in this house? What happened to him? And it's kind of shown through like flashbacks that he has while he's sleeping, like reflecting on like his memories of his father and his memories of like what he was like when he was like in the factory, when he was like being constructed, if you will. And you see that the life just fades away out of Vincent Price, and he just falls to the ground, and he never got the ability to like teach Edward the ability to interact normally with other people. He the idea of Edward Scissorhands is that he is just like a blank slate, effectively. Like, he only has like some basic concepts of like interaction, and even that's pretty fickle. in a way. And so, I mean, we might as well get into the story really of Edward
Yeah,
Scissorhands at
let's
this
get into
point.
the
Yeah.
story. Yeah.
Right, so one evening, an elderly woman tells her granddaughter a bedtime story of a young man named Edward Scissorhands. Many years later, Peg Bogg, who is a local door-to-door Avon saleswoman, tries to sell the decrepit Gothic mansion where Edward lives. The creation of an old inventor, Edward is an ageless humanoid. The inventor homeschooled Edward but died of a heart attack before giving Edward hands, leaving him unfinished. Peg finds Edward alone and offers to take him into her home after discovering he is virtually harmless. Peg introduces Edward to her husband Bill, their young son Kevin, and their teenage daughter Kim. Edward falls in love with Kim despite her initial fear of him. As the neighbors are curious about the new house guest, the Boggs throw a neighborhood barbecue welcoming him. Most of the neighbors are fascinated by Edward and befriend him, except for the eccentric religious fanatic Esmerelda and Kim's super religious boyfriend Jim. So that's basically our setup. So, in a way, this kind of sets up like, you would think this would be like a generic setup for like a horror movie, wouldn't you? Like, this is like
it feels akin to like Frankenstein, where you have Dr. Frankenstein who creates a monster. The monster is a blank slate, but then after a while, when he's being constantly abused by Frankenstein's assistant Fritz, and then when he wanders around and he's just basically like really confused about the world around him. He doesn't necessarily have a clue on it because he was literally just stitched together in body parts. And, the only thing he's ever gotten was just fear and abuse and trying to comprehend on what is this creature that has just come into this world. And Edward is kind of equivalent to a Frankenstein-like monster in which he's a blank slate. The only, person he's ever interacted with is the person who created him. And then when the creator dies, he's just left absolutely alone and isolated. And then finally, somebody comes into the picture and interacts with him and finally brings him out into the world. And he's just trying to comprehend it, but at the same time, there's just a lovableness. He's just very lovable to everybody and uses his scissor hands in very unique ways. And everybody seems to really enjoy his company and are just fascinated with his eccentricities. But then there's always one person who's just absolutely fearful of him and thinks that he's just an abomination and he needs to go away because he doesn't fit into the cookie cutter society.
Well, when you really look at it, like every single character is like has an effect on our protagonist in all of this. Like, you have Peg who takes sympathy on Edward Scissorhands and tries, and she's really, sentimental towards him because she realizes, that there's more to him than, just a monster. Like, this is someone who is, just completely isolated from the world and doesn't know how to interact with it. So she takes him in, and which, there are people out there, that will do that for people. And so Peg is like a representative of that type of person. Whereas, the other people, like there is the religious fanatic Esmeralda, who, is the opposite. She completely wants to isolate Edward because she, wrongly believes that, this person is like some kind of evil monster who's going to, wreak havoc at some point, and is trying to turn, the entire neighborhood against Edward. And then you have Jim, who is coming in from a different angle because he's jealous, obviously, because he has the attention of the teenage girl in this. And I'm trying to find the name. I do apologize. What was her name?
Which one? The teenage girl?
The teenage girl, yeah. Falls in love with Kim, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
Kim.
Yeah. So Kim, is taking an interest, even though at the first she, is disgusted by Edward, but then later on starts to grow to like him as she starts to know him. But then obviously Jim is not happy with that, and so obviously gets envious, and that's the reason why he wants to destroy Edward Scissorhands because he's going it from that angle,
right?
If you will.
Right.
So you got Jim who's coming from an angle of envy, and you got Esmeralda who's coming from an angle of, if anything, ignorance, if you will.
Yeah, ignorance.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then you see like other people who like have their own interactions with Edward because you have one character who tries to seduce him. Pretty much on two occasions, and almost gets away with one of them in the salon. So there is that there's that interaction, and then you have other people who like want to. There's another character who like will basically stir up like talk over the character, not really like just not because obviously she's just a bored housewife and just wants to basically stir up all the other characters in just in gossip, if you will. So like
Right.
chatting on the phone and things like that. So like if you notice like when you watch this movie, every single character has a different interaction with Edward.
Right.
And I think that's very interesting. If anything, you can probably look at this and say this is the idea of basic, characters. And I get, there's loads of animes out there, like you have like the stereotypical like three girls, which is like the happy one, the angry one, and like the clueless one, if
Oh
you will.
yeah,
But,
yeah.
I think
Just like you would in every single typical anime, in which you have like the psychotic one, you have the very sweet and shy one, you have the hyperactive one, you have the clueless one. Yeah, I mean, you have essentially like a checklist of everything that you would see in an anime.
Yeah, I think this is better example of like different characters having different interactions with our protagonist, and I think this gives if anything, I think people can learn from this movie. I
Yeah,
think
it's
the way
definitely
that.
a really interesting character piece. You definitely learn about, the main character is a blank slate and he's trying to learn everything around him. By just his eccentricities, he's able to be an impact for better and for worse for everybody that he meets around with. I think that this is a great character piece because characters is something that we really gravitate whenever that we see a movie. Sure, a lot of people may think it's the story. Sure, some people may think it's the special effects or something like that. But no, I mean, if a character works, then the entire story would work. But if the characters don't work, then you're not going to be fully invested in it.
Yeah. Also, this movie is actually kind of refreshing because it's not like you got Edward Scissorhands. Let's be honest, he looks like a murderous psychopath.
He
But
does,
he
yes.
does. Like I mean, today he probably look like every typical goth except without the scissor fingers. But I mean, like back in the 1990s, he would basically be an outcast. He will be isolated. Pretty much, and so there's that. But everyone, funny enough, everyone like just gives him like a fair shake, and just like everyone takes him in, pretty much.
Yeah,
Like
yeah. You
they
would
let
think
him
that throughout
they
the
let him
beginning
cut
of the
his.
movie, very similar to like Frankenstein, that people will be fearful of him. They'll just like stay away from him. He's dangerous. And then like maybe towards like the second or third act, they'll be like, oh, but he's not such a bad guy. But no, they actually give him a fair chance like right early on, which is actually pretty refreshing.
Yeah, so they're going as far as like they'll let them trim their hedges, they'll let them trim their dogs, they'll let them trim their own hair, things like that. Like anything that basically needs trimming,
And,
they'll
and
let
then
him
there's
do.
also the ice
Oh,
sculptures.
the ice sculptures too. Like there's that too, and then it only kind of like comes to a problem when they have to basically deal with like the reality because Edward can't basically just live on like good intentions effectively. So like that he needs to basically have his own life effectively, and that's what they try to do. But they go to the bank to try and like get him to like start his own business, but he has no social security, he has no history, he has no job, he's had no car, he's virtually had nothing that would allow him to get a loan to start his business. So they that's out the window. So and this is the interesting, this is where like the misconstrues go. And by the way, this, dare I say, this is probably a better way of like doing the misunderstanding in halfway through the movie, because like you have like the typical movie where like you have the protagonist and then you have like all the characters and then you have the big misunderstanding, they all go their separate ways, they realize how dumb they've been, and then they come up for the finale. Like
Yeah.
we've seen loads of movies like that, loads of Disney movies, loads of DreamWorks movies, loads of like all the movies that we kind of watch kind of do that thing. Dare I say this does it more in an interesting way than I
Yeah,
think there's some other
absolutely.
movies do, because like Edward basically joins the gang of teenagers, joins Kim, Jim, and everybody else because he's been tricked into thinking that they're gonna steal some stuff back which was stolen from them, and he has no idea like how society works. So of course he goes along with it. So then he ends up getting in trouble for it, and but then he realizes that it was Jim's house, but he wasn't going to say anything because it was to impress Kim, effectively, because he's in love with him. But the Peg and his husband come in, and they think that the reason why he robbed their house is because he's trying to get the money to start the business. But they use the defense of like, oh well, of course he's going to do that because he has no idea of like how society is actually supposed to work between right and wrong. and things
Exactly.
like that. And even the police agree, and like, oh wow, like which is kind of refreshing when you really think about it, unlike today. But I digress. But because the psychologist comes in and says, oh well, he's had no idea of like how societies were really to work because he was isolated for so long. So the police actually take sympathy with him and so it's like, okay, well, don't do it again, effectively.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think that that's great because ordinarily, when you have the police show up, it's like, okay, here we go. He's gonna get arrested. We're gonna see Edward in jail, and he's gonna be like sitting down and not understanding what's gonna happen, and then everybody's gonna think he's a menace, and then finally, maybe like towards the end, then we find out that it was a misunderstanding. But no, it actually just cuts to it right away, saying, no, this guy has been in a mansion pretty much for a long time, not understanding on how life works. And the fact that the police know about it and everybody else know about it, even the psychologist knows about it, saying, yeah, this guy, we need to help him out, as opposed to like, no, we need to stay away from him because he's clearly trouble. I told you from the moment that I looked at him with his weird scissor hands and his posture, I knew he was going to be trouble. But no, they don't do this. They don't do this at all.
Yeah, exactly. In a way, I don't really like the finale of this movie.
I
In a
don't
way,
either.
no, it's just like it kind of like gives like the idea. Oh well, if you have a suspicious, if you have like a jealous boyfriend who like tries to ruin your life, kill him. It's
Yeah.
just like it's not a great message to kind of leave away with this movie, but I guess maybe it is like a message like saying, well, this is like society can be unfair sometimes. I'm guessing,
I
but
guess maybe.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of Frankenstein movies in which, a lot of characters die, whether it be the villain and then the monster dies, or that the villain dies, or the monster dies. So I guess they're trying to say, get rid of the thing that is bad, and then you have the ending. So
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it just
it would
goes
have been
way out of
better
place.
if, like, I think Back to the Future did it best. I think in regards to, like, when Biff, obviously got his comeuppance in the end,
Yes.
after doing all the things that he did. Like, his comeuppance, I think, is better. I mean, they should have kind of done it the way Back to the Future did, in my
Yeah,
opinion. It's like,
in Back to the Future, Biff was the bully in the 50s, and throughout the course of the 80s, he was constantly bullying towards Mr. McFly. But then when Marty went back in time and helped gain his dad the confidence to stand up against Biff, he was able to retroactively change the future where now Biff is helping, Mr. McFly and the family. So yeah, I guess where he was able to get the confidence to stand up to him, and then finally he was able to kind of like chill him down, whereas, oh no, this guy is bad. How we're going to be able to deal with it? Are we going to sit down and talk to him? No, we're just going to kill him.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's I think it's a bad way to kind of like end the movie. In my opinion, it should have just been like, oh, Jim gets his comeuppance, and then like Edward realizes that he's done like his work is done basically in the neighborhood. He goes off into like maybe he goes off into the mansion, like does all this stuff, and like they all just kind of agree to leave each other alone, or he could have been like he decides to leave the mansion, go elsewhere, like because there's more to the world than just this neighborhood and this mall. Like he probably go off elsewhere and like find his calling,
Yeah,
if you will.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could have been a case in which when maybe Edward just felt unsatisfied because there were still going to be people out there in the neighborhood that were going to hate him and misunderstand him. And then he's like, you know what? There's a whole world out there. I can explore it. I can find somebody who is going to be more caring towards me than the people in this neighborhood. I mean, I could travel around and maybe I can get a clear understanding of what the world is like. But no, we don't exactly get that.
Yeah. So in regards to the presentation of this movie, the way that things are, like, doesn't this movie kind of feel like this should be like taking place in like, not like medieval times, but like the old times, if you will, like, there should be like a bunch of villagers like in these old houses, like kind of like trying to get by, if you will. And here comes Edward Scissorhands kind of like help things out. But I mean, no, they decided to put this in the 70s, which is
Yeah, they
interesting.
decided to put it in the 1970s. Yeah, I think so because I mean, throughout the beginning of the movie, we have the old woman telling the bedtime story to her granddaughter, and it makes it and look like that it's either in the 60s or the 70s, which I guess kind of makes sense because it was the radical age in which there was a lot of change that was happening and it was shaking up from what the 40s and the 50s was able to bring past World War II, where things were a lot more peaceful yet conservative. So I guess that's a really interesting take on it because because it would have fit within the message and the moral of what this story was trying to be in the 2/3 of the movie right before the ending just kind of killed it.
Hmm. So, but I think the whole presentation of the movie, I think, is very like it is quite strange. Like it's like one world ends and one world begins, if you will.
Yeah.
Like it's like two worlds kind of colliding with one another, and it's two eras, if you will, because like obviously the era of like the inventor obviously was several decades before, and it looks like Edward Scissorhands is has basically lasted the test of time effectively, even though he's been living in squalor pretty much
Yeah,
this entire
exactly.
time.
Yeah, he's ageless. He doesn't age at all. He's, going to be forever staying that way because he was created in that sense.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I actually really like this because you're right. A story like this would have taken place like hundreds of years ago, like we see in Frankenstein and when we see with the Mummy and Dracula, in which it does take place like maybe towards like the 17th or 18th century. Like it does feel like it's fits with that, but it takes a more contemporary twist in which, okay, what would happen if Frankenstein was in our time period? Or what would happen if, Dracula or what would happen if the Mummy or the Wolfman was in our time period? And he's just trying to comprehend modern society. I think that's interesting. Because nowadays when we see more contemporary takes on horror films, they're either one of two camps. They either take place in modern times or they take place in the past. And in recent years when we gotten like remakes and reboots of classic stories like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, so on and so forth, they take place in their respective time periods that they were released in, like around when Mary Shelley wrote the book around the 1800s, it takes place in the 1800s. And when King Kong was released in 1933, Peter Jackson did the adaptation taking place in the 1930s, and so on and so forth. The Shape of Water by Guillermo del Toro, which is basically like a newer take on Creature from the Black Lagoon, takes place around the 1950s and 60s during a time in which it was like an interesting take on like accepting those who are different from you, which makes a lot of sense in the context of it. But yeah, you don't really see a lot of horror movies or classic monsters being in our world. When you see modern takes on horror movies, they're like slashers or genuine horror films. But yeah, I would say that this is definitely like a very unique take on having a Frankenstein like monster in the 21st century.
Yeah. So, one thing that's basically it is interesting is that you have the whole setup of like the suburban neighborhood like in the 70s, like the dads all go off in their cars off to work or to play golf or whatever, and the house the women stay at home, and I think there's only two things that have survived from that era of things, and that is there's still women going around selling Avon products, and there's still bored housewives at home having sex with plumbers. So.
Sure. Yeah. The last time that Avon was relevant in my life was over 15 years ago, where I actually knew someone who went around door to door selling Avon products.
Well,
So,
that's still happening.
yeah.
They still, Avon's still like, getting people to like, go around and have, we're selling their products to like, friends and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just not as much as it used to be, but it's still around.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's the whole board, housewives having sex with plumbers.
Oh yeah, that's still going on.
Yeah, that's still going on. Yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very pivotal movie for Tim Burton, not only because, it went back to his gothic indie roots, but also this is the first appearance of Johnny Depp as like his main character. Because if you remember before, he would have Michael Keaton perform as both Beetlejuice and Batman. So yeah, this will be the first out of many appearances of Johnny Depp in his movies.
Yeah. So I mean, like, well, this kind of set things off really. So for
It,
Johnny
it
Depp.
did, yeah, because Tim Burton saw Johnny Depp in 21 Jump Street, the TV series, and he was very impressed with his performance, and so he decided to bring him in. And yeah, from what I read, Edward Scissorhands' performance was based off of Johnny Depp watching a lot of Charlie Chaplin silent films and trying to get the blank expression from when he would perform in his short films. So yeah, I mean, it definitely does show Johnny Depp's versatility because around before 21 Jump Street, he was also in Nightmare on Elm Street and various other short roles in other films. So this was kind of like one of the major films that really brought in and out until eventually we would know him for like other major roles like Jack Sparrow and Pirates of the Caribbean and various other things. So yeah,
By
this
the way, this was Winona Ryder's like probably second movie within the 90s before like she basically just became like a massive deal. So
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And we saw Winona Ryder before, she was Lydia in Beetlejuice. But yeah, this was around the time in which she was really starting to get more popular towards a lot more movie roles. She also did, Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. She was in Martin Scorsese, The Age of Innocence. She was in Little Women. And then after a while, I think like Girl Interrupted was where, she really started becoming a lot more mainstream towards cinema.
and by the way, she's actually going to be doing the next Beetlejuice movie.
That's right.
Uh,
Yeah, she is. She's going to be reprising her role as Lydia, which is going to be great. Yeah, and once again, Danny Elfman is back to doing the music, and yeah, I would say that he definitely captures the whimsicalness of like suburban life, while at the same time the creepy and eeriness of when we get over to the mansion and when we get to see Edward. So yeah, Danny Elfman captures the soundtrack once again really, really well.
yeah. So
And yeah,
I don't think
I would
that.
say that yeah, everybody does a really great job with their performances. I really do believe that they are these characters, and I really do enjoy the fact that we're able to see their complexities and their simplicities whenever that they appear on the screen. So yeah, I would say that, like I said, I mean, as a character piece, it's a great movie, and I would recommend that you check it out. Just don't expect a great ending. That's probably the weakest thing about this movie.
Yeah. By the way, and one thing I think in a way, like this movie was somewhat unlucky because this we got nominated for like several awards, but unfortunately didn't get a chance to win. I mean, it only really won a BAFTA award, and it got a couple of nominations for like other stuff, but unfortunately, like nothing really major really for that. But I mean, it definitely has recognition in nominations, but not unfortunately, it doesn't really come back with many wins,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
that's a shame too, because it definitely did deserve to get at least maybe some wins, at least for makeup and at least for costumes. But no, not necessarily. I think for makeup, Dick Tracy won of all things.
Yeah, like not many people talk about Dick Tracy anymore, really.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say that. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it's not, yeah, I mean, I would say that awards don't necessarily make a great film. I mean, yeah, we don't talk about Dick Tracy anymore, but people still talk about Edward Scissorhands. So even though it didn't win a lot of awards, it still got the win in the end, in which people still regard it as like one of Tim Burton's best films.
Hmm.
All right, so that wraps up our discussion of Edward Scissorhands. So tune in next time as we continue with our Tim Burton month with another one of Tim Burton's best films that is still beloved for both Halloween and Christmas. We're going to be talking about The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Cool. Oh, sorry. I thought that was going to be the end.
If you want to say your goodbyes, you can.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.